Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Have your attention, please. Talk quiet, please. Thank you. All right, so here we go. Civil War. We're actually going to get into the Civil War, not just the unit Civil War. So have your notes ready to go. You ready? If you want to look on page 2 at the very top, Impact of Abraham Lincoln, we're going to be covering those 3 bullet points, and then we're going to get into some, but not all, of the bullet point on major Civil War battles. All right, so we're going to be looking at things leading up to the Civil War, and then some of the early stages of the Civil War. Yeah, it's all good. Okay, so you guys ready? All right, let's go ahead and get this going. Okay, let me bring this up. All right, here we go. So the year is 1860. Big presidential election in the midst of lots and lots of controversy having to do with slavery, the spread of slavery. Wow. I mean, it's kind of like, oh, we got a presidential election this year. Wow, 2020. Let's not have a civil war as a result of the presidential election outcome. Needless to say, the person who was president in 1860s, James Buchanan, you forgot about him, huh? Yeah, he's going to be kind of like a non entity in this whole thing. In fact, after the election and the Civil War actually gets started on his watch. He's not going to do much about it. I mean, he's just like, wow. Didn't even run for re-election. So what you want to look at is who are the candidates. Now, typically, in most presidential election years, you have candidates from the top 2 parties. Well, okay, so the top 2 parties today are Republican and Democratic Party. Well, back then, the Republican Party was a new party. I mean, just to kind of remind yourselves of something, let's see, going back here, yeah, 1856, the Republican Party was the main party. You had the, what was it, the American Party, the Know-Nothings, remember those guys? I mean, they did okay, but this new party, the Republican Party, was starting to make some headway. The Whigs had kind of gone on, who are the Whigs? I mean, they'd kind of like started to disappear. And now you've got this anti-slavery, or at least anti-spread of slavery political party called the Republican Party. And they're going to be involved in the 1860 election as well, right? So we got Lincoln here. Before we get to Lincoln, let's talk about the other major party, okay, the Democratic Party. Well, there's a split, right? There's a split. Let's talk about Stephen Douglas first. Write his name down. He always wanted to be president, and he's going to get the presidential the nomination of the Democratic Party, or at least part of it. This big national party that's been around for a long time, the Democratic Party, has a bit of a split. You see, Douglas liked popular sovereignty. He liked that. He's like, let the people decide. Well, now you got this Dred Scott decision in the Supreme Court going, hey, if you own slaves, you can take them wherever you want. Supreme Court's on the side of Southern slave owners. And they're like, hey, we've got a Supreme Court decision. We don't need Stephen Douglas and his popular sovereignty stuff. So Douglas lost a lot of support in the Deep South, right, over the issue of popular sovereignty. Northern Democrats are okay with Douglas. They're like, okay, we'll go with him. But the Southern Democrats split off. And so that's why you see right here, John Breckinridge, who is from Kentucky. He gets the support of Southern Democrats who support, the Dred Scott decision, and, says he supports popular sovereignty, but reality is the Democrats are split. Oh my gosh, they are, yeah, this is a mess. And it creates some interesting opportunities, because if you've got the Democrats split, who else can come into the void? Well, you got another candidate here, John Bell. You can talk about him for a minute. He's from like a border state, Tennessee, and his party is the Constitutional Union, and it's a lot of people from the old Whig Party, although a lot of those guys ended up joining the Republican Party, and then the American Party, the Know-Nothings. So they got John Bell, and he's going to do a little bit better in kind of the border states. All right, and then you got the Republican Party candidate, which is actually in this election is going to be worth something. Lincoln had never been elected to anything except for several terms in the House of Representatives, even at that much. That didn't get elected to the Senate. So how is Lincoln well known around the country, or at least well known in the northern states that have a Republican Party? By the way, the South doesn't like the Republican Party, and Republican Party candidates aren't even going to be listed on the ballot in many southern states. Yeah, they're not into that. So how was it? Remember, how was it that Lincoln became so popular among like Republican voters and so forth in the North? Oh, remember that election that he was involved in and the debates that were widely publicized just 2 years before? So they had a lot of voters in places like Pennsylvania and Ohio and New York who were like, let's maybe go with this Lincoln guy. Although Senator William Seward from New York, a Republican senator, he wanted the nomination. He didn't get it. And so the Republicans are going to, you know, somewhat reluctantly, I suppose, unite behind Abraham Lincoln. Okay? So there you go. Elections in November. Okay? That's when you have the election. And basically what you're doing is you're electing electors, and the electors get together and then they, you know, put their electoral votes in. And then after a while, well, when does the new president come in? This is important. Back in those days, the president took the oath of office in March of the year following the election. So we're going to go from November, December, January, February, March is when Lincoln's going to be sworn in. Surprise, Lincoln wins. Nowadays, it's January 20th, right? So the next president is going to be sworn in January 20th, 2021. Either Trump takes the oath of office again, or it's Biden, or who knows, you know, still got some months to go. So what do you think? Who's going to get the most votes? Well, I'll tell you what, the person who gets the second most votes actually gets the least, comes in fourth when it comes to electoral votes. Because in order to get electoral votes, most states have it set up so that if you come in first, you get all the electoral votes for that state. So it doesn't really help necessarily to come in second place. Lincoln got the most votes, and almost entirely in the northern states, the non-slave states, and some western states too. 1.8 million votes of individual people voting for electors in each of the states. And that was like 39, almost 40% of the people voted for Lincoln. That's not a majority, but he did get a majority of the electoral vote. He had 180 electoral votes, which was more than 50%. It was plenty. You'll see on the chart here. Let me get to the next slide. We got the next number of votes. Douglas, right? 1.3 million, and they were spread out around the country. Votes in the North and the South. But he only carried one state and part of another. And so he only got 12 electoral votes. Didn't even come close. He's the one who came in fourth. Breckinridge, 0.8 million. And he did very well in the South. He actually came in second in electoral votes. He got 72 electoral votes. Breckinridge did. And then Bell, he came fourth as far as popular vote, 0.5 million, just a 500,000 votes. But he carried the states of Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. So let's take a look and show you, because this is very interesting to look at this map. I always love looking at historical maps and election maps and so forth. You can tell all kinds of things. Jumping right out at you, by the way, back when they made this map, or whatever, who made this map, they're like, blue, that's the Republican Party. Today, red is the Republican Party, but whatever, don't worry about that. And, you know, anyway, so here's Lincoln, does very well in the northern states. Obviously, you've got this kind of brown area. Those are territories. They're not states yet. They don't have senators. They don't participate officially in presidential elections, right? Even Idaho wasn't even officially known as Idaho Territory. At that time, it was the Washington Territory. But, I mean, who's going to create Idaho as actually a territory during, it's Lincoln, during his presidency. Cool. Anyway, another thing just to look at here, look at the number of electoral votes from some states like California, 4, Texas, 4, Florida, 3. I mean, those are among the biggest, if not the biggest states in the country today, but not very big back then. The top 3 populous states with lots of electors back in those days: New York, number 1, there's 35 electoral votes, Pennsylvania with 27 electoral votes, and New York and Pennsylvania and Ohio are all still very big today, but they were the biggest by far back in those days. Delaware's always small, so it's Rhode Island. Yeah, whatever. So take a look. There you go. You got the different pie charts. So there you've got the electoral votes. 59% of the electoral votes go to Lincoln. He wins, all right, because you need a majority of that. But there he is with only 40% of the overall popular vote. There's Douglas, you know, looking pretty good, but pretty shabby as far as the electoral votes. There's Missouri, and I don't know how New Jersey split it up, but anyway, he gets some of the New Jersey votes. There's the Constitutional Union with Bell in the mid-states, but the deep South, again, goes for Breckinridge. So you have an election. It was conducted. We have our elections. They're actually going to have one. The next election was at 1864. It's during the Civil War. It will take place. People are like, are we going to have a presidential election during the coronavirus? Yeah. I mean, the Constitution says we actually have to have a new president sworn in January 20th, 2021. So we're going to have an election. So we'll figure it out. Just do mail-in, whatever. Yeah. So is this a big deal? This election of Lincoln? It's huge. It's absolutely huge. All right. There's an anticipation. If you listen to Lincoln, you know, he's like, it's Republican Party against the spread of slavery. And Southerners are like, this is different. They were used to having presidents that were just sort of like hands off. Right. So now you got somebody who is like openly opposed to the spread of slavery. Although, you know, Lincoln didn't take positions saying, oh, I'm in favor of abolishing slavery. I mean, he's not an abolitionist. He's a politician. But the Southern states, they start talking amongst themselves. The Southern voters are like, this is not going to be good. Oh my gosh, if Lincoln is president, terrible things are going to happen. What should we do? What should we do? Well, they start talking about secession, leaving the country, right? And this is after the election, before Lincoln is sworn in March of 1861. They start gathering in conventions in their various different states. And it is in South Carolina. They go first. They're like one of the leaders. Remember, they were like talking about secession because they didn't like some tariff thing. We talked about that before. South Carolina. In December of 1860, they have a convention in South Carolina, and they vote unanimously to leave, to get out. Can you do that? I mean, you voluntarily join, whatever, you know, signed on, ratified the Constitution. So can they leave? I mean, this is an interesting question. Can they leave? Well, they don't want to leave just by themselves, because they're like, you know, in case there's problems, maybe they want some others to leave. Well, here you go. Write it down. Right after that, in order, we got South Carolina, and then Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. All right, so you got some of the deep South states, and they are seceding. And they decide to form up, the Confederate States of the United States of America. All right, and that's created. So it's like, oh, they're going to be a separate country. Well, yeah. This is actually the battle flag of the Confederate States of the United States of America. They had another flag, but this is probably the one that's most familiar that continues on with that. Okay, let's look at some of the other ones. Well, actually, let's go ahead and go to this one right here. So there we go. There's the initial states coming in here. And then some of the ones that came afterwards, you have, you know, eventually you're going to have Arkansas, and these next ones are going to actually come after. Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, Arkansas. They join after Lincoln becomes president of the United States, actually takes the oath of office. No more will, right? You're going to have, take a look at these ones right here. These are border states: Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia. Well, it wasn't West Virginia then. I'll tell you about that. Anyway, that part of Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, are all slave-owning states, and they allow slavery. In fact, so right here, right in there, they don't show it right there, it was the Washington District of Columbia, the nation's capital. Slavery was allowed in the nation's capital there. And so, yeah, this is going to be very, very, very interesting. As Lincoln is coming into town, into Washington, D.C., areas in Illinois, and he comes by train, and he's going to go through Maryland. There's some folks in Maryland that don't like Lincoln. They're like pro-slavery, and they didn't vote for Lincoln. And so, I mean, they're like making threats and disrupting railways. And Lincoln actually had to kind of sneak in to the nation's capital. Can you imagine that? Sneaking into the nation's capital to get ready for your inauguration. That was on March 4th, 1861. Lincoln is president, takes the oath of office. What is he going to do about these states that have left? He's like, I don't really think they can leave. But is he going to start a fight? This is very interesting. When you look in history, is he going to start a fight? He'd like to have some compromise, right? Sometimes the one who starts the fight is actually, there's a disadvantage to that, because then other people see you as the aggressor. Well, any of these southern states want to like start a fight to make the issue clear that they're going to be leaving? Well, it turns out the answer is South Carolina. Yep. The Civil War starts in South Carolina, okay? The secession started before Lincoln came in, but the Civil War will begin in South Carolina. The United States, the Union, has, of course, military installations in various different parts of the United States, including in the harbor at Charleston, right there, the main city in South Carolina, a Fort Sumter. And Lincoln basically says to the commander at Fort Sumter, don't hand it over. I know South Carolina is telling you to hand it over and so forth because it's in South Carolina, but don't do that. And the Confederates are like, you got to hand it over. I'm not going to surrender. So they attack. There you go. April 12th, 1861, the attack on Fort Sumter. Okay. 34-hour bombardment. Yeah, so this is in the War of 1812 where they surrender after 1 hour. But a surrender did ultimately come. None were killed, thankfully. The men who were being bombarded went into deep shelter and they survived. But ultimately, you know, the Union flag was pulled down and replaced with a Confederate flag. Not this particular one, I don't think, but a Confederate flag. And that created a very interesting situation because then, of course, you've got going back to here, then you got some pressure and they're looking at it. It was a big one. When Virginia went to the Confederacy, that's a big one because Virginia's right across the water from Washington, D.C. That was a big one. And as you can see right here, it's a fairly, I want to say, yep, it's the largest populated state in the South, okay, among the Confederate States. So that was a big, big concern. And a lot of fighting is going to take place in Virginia, and it's going to be very, very impactful. Yeah. But the North, it was fascinating because there was a real reaction in the North. It's like, hey, look, South, you know, we don't really feel so nice about you Confederates. And now Lincoln's saying, hey, you know, we're not going to let you leave. Stick to the Union. Because the South went first, the South fought first, there is going to be an impetus to stick with Lincoln, stick to the Union, Union forever. What is Lincoln fighting for? The Union. Now notice what they're not fighting for officially at this point, to get rid of slavery. That is not on the table yet. Will be as things move on. And in fact, it's fascinating because, you know, the Southerners took a chance. They were like, hey, well, you know, we're afraid that maybe they're going to get rid of slavery if we stay in the Union. So maybe we should leave and then we'll be completely in charge of our destiny. Well, guess what? If you leave and you lose the war, you might end up losing your ability to continue on with slavery. And in fact, that's exactly what's going to happen. Okay, that's going to be part of the story. Let's take a look here just for a bit. The Confederacy, the Confederate States, they're like, it's fascinating because they're like, we want to leave, but we want to stick together as states that want to leave. And so, you know, initially they set up their capital in Alabama, and then they moved it to Richmond, Virginia. And you got Jefferson Davis was chosen as their president. He was a graduate of West Point, so United States Military Academy, a veteran of the Mexican-American War. And he was given the responsibility of trying to manage this Confederate states that like to leave, and then they had to get together. And then, of course, their number one job is to win their independence. 11 states. And they weren't really always keen at following the leadership of a national government. Who knew? So it's going to be a big, big, big challenge for him, right? I mean, ultimately, is he, the Confederate, as leader of the Confederacy, ultimately is going to be able to prevail? No, spoilers. The South loses. The Confederates lose. 1865. He's going to be captured when the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, falls. And yeah, we'll talk about his fate later on. What's going to happen to Jefferson Davis? Was he a good strategist? Was he too rigid? Was he a poor delegator? I mean, let's just not put it all on him that the South lost, right? We'll give Lincoln a lot of credit for the victory in the North, but there are some other things that we're going to be looking at with respect to why did the North win? Why did the South lose? There are some things that are already on the table. It's like industrial factors, population factors, the ability to continue and create a strong military. The North had it, right? The South, you will see, and I'm sure I'll mention this again later, the South tended to have, certainly in the early stages, better generals, real good tactical leaders. And they had some key victories. But eventually the North is going to catch up as far as the good generals, and they will be able to pound ultimately for victory for the North. Okay, so interesting question. Jefferson Davis, could you actually really won this thing? I don't know. If it had been anybody else, I don't know that it would have necessarily made a difference. But we'll look at those things as we go now into the war. Of course, we got Abraham Lincoln. You got to look at Abraham Lincoln. Number one goal, preserve the Union. Later, as part of preserving the Union and fighting the fight, he is going to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the slaves in captive territory, rebel territory, and so forth. We'll look very, very closely at Lincoln. He's got big challenges as president of the United States, right? It will, the rest of the Union support this, or is there going to be some that are going to just let them go? Let the Confederates go, for goodness sakes, just let them go. He doesn't hand over the Union forts. So obviously we saw the South is attacking. And so his big thing right there early on is going to be preserve the Union, preserve the Union, preserve the Union. So Mr. Freedom and Equality and so forth. Although, let's get to the reality. He wants to win this war. We're going to talk about all the different things he does in order to win this war. And in order to win the war, he might take away some freedom. What are you talking about? The writ of habeas corpus is an old idea. It basically says, I have a right to not be thrown in jail for no good cause. In fact, if you put me in jail, you have to say why you're putting me in jail. Otherwise, you have to release me from jail, right? So writ of habeas corpus. Lincoln suspended that. In places like Maryland, some of the border states where you had some Southern sympathizers called Copperheads, right? There's a cartoon at the time. These are some of the same people who were like, disrupting the railway traffic going into Washington, D.C. I mean, it's weird because you've got the nation's capital with Lincoln in it in the middle of slave territory, right next to the Confederacy in Virginia. And Maryland, you got a lot of Southern sympathizers there. So Lincoln was like, I got this. If we can identify Southern sympathizers, we're going to put them in jail for the duration of the war. And there were folks that are going, you can't do that. And they fight their cases in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court's like, national security, we can't. It's like, interesting that this is coming up now. Not the Civil War, we got coronavirus and so forth, but can the government, in the interest of national security or health or whatever and so forth, restrict people's freedoms? Well, Lincoln did, and he got away with it during the Civil War. It only happens one other time for national security purposes, and we issue a big apology for it later on. And World War II, some of you guys know this, in World War II, the United States gets hit by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor, and the United States is like, rah, we can't trust people of Japanese origin. And so we round up Japanese Americans on the Pacific coast and put them in internment for the duration of World War II. And then afterwards, like, actually, those people were really loyal and they fought for the United States of America. And oops, sorry, we blew that. Here's an apology and here's a check because I know you had to sell your houses and businesses at like bargain basement prices. Anyway, writ of habeas corpus, Lincoln suspends it for the war, okay? Interesting, political military strategist, Lincoln. I mean, he's not like a veteran or so forth in war. And his political career, wasn't long or anything, but man, people look back and go, whoa, he actually did it. This is amazing. This was a huge, huge crisis. One of the things that he did is there were a lot of rivals within the Republican Party. And he actually, as the title suggests right here in the book, he built a team of rivals. So for example, let's see, number 4 right here, William Seward, like the very powerful senator from New York. Lincoln's like, so it's not like he's an enemy, but he's a rival, so keep him close. He gives him one of the top positions in the cabinet. Secretary of State. So he's his top foreign policy advisor and a very close advisor. Okay, so keep them on your team, because otherwise they're going to be like nip, 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 trying to get you on the other side. Salmon Chase, there you see, you want to get his name as well. Salmon Chase, an Ohio governor, very radical, like anti-slavery and so forth. And he is going to be given the position of Secretary of the Treasury. Salmon Chase. Okay, the Attorney General, the head of the Justice Department. Okay, Edward Bates, he's from the state of Missouri, so a slave state, although it stays in the Union, and he tends to be fairly conservative on the issue of slavery, as in like, you know, we don't necessarily need to get rid of it at this point, do we? Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, there we go. He had been the Attorney General under the previous president, who was a Democrat, you know, Buchanan. And so you've got these four people in here in particular. Let me see, did I leave one? Oh yeah, there's Lincoln, number 5, number 3 there. And so they're working together, right? Lincoln's got them on his team, and over time he wins them over, and they become quite loyal, and then ultimately they're going to help Lincoln to win the war. Okay. And of course, as we'll get into it, as far as Lincoln's generals, we'll talk about that here just in a bit. Lincoln's goal: win, win, win. He's going to have some challenges with his generals, but more on that later. Let's take a pause here, and let's get some other guy who gets on the YouTube. Very, very good. Shall we do a John Green crash course episode on the election of 1860? So let me, yeah, that's what we want to go to. Yep. Let me go ahead and get that new share in here. Okay, enlarge. And where's the play? Come on. And here we go.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we discuss one of the most confusing questions in American history. What caused the Civil War? Just kidding, it's not a confusing question at all. Slavery caused the Civil War. Mr. Green, but what about like states' rights and nationalism, economics? Me from the past, your senior year of high school, you will be taught American government by Mr. Fleming, a white Southerner who will seem to you to be about 182 years old, and you will say something to him in class about states' rights, and Mr. Fleming will turn to you and he will say, a state's right to what, sir? And for the first time in your snotty little life, you will be well and truly speechless. The road to the Civil War leads to discussions of states' rights, to slavery, and differing economic systems, specifically whether those economic systems should involve slavery, and the election of Abraham Lincoln, specifically how his election impacted slavery, but none of those things would have been issues without slavery. So let's pick up with the most controversial section of the Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law. Now, longtime Crash Course viewers will remember that there was already a Fugitive Slave Law written into the United States Constitution. So what made this one so controversial? Under this new law, any citizen was required to turn in anyone he or she knew to be a slave to authorities, and that made like every person in New England into a sheriff, and it also required them to enforce a law they found abhorrent. So they had to be sheriffs, and they didn't even get little gold badges. Thought bubble, can I have a gold badge? Oh. Awesome, thank you. This law was also terrifying to people of color in the North because even if you'd, say, been born free in Massachusetts, the courts could send you into slavery if even one person swore before a judge that you were a specific slave. And many people of color responded to the Fugitive Slave Law by moving to Canada, which at the time was still technically an English colony, thereby further problematizing the whole idea that England was all about tyranny and the United States was all about freedom. But anyway, the most important result of the Fugitive Slave Law was that it convinced some Northerners that the government was in the hands of a sinister slave power. Sadly, slave power was not a heavy metal band or Britney Spears' new single or even a secret cabal of powerful slaves, but rather a conspiracy theory about a secret cabal of pro-slavery congressmen. That conspiracy theory is going to grow in importance, but before we get to that, let us discuss railroads. Underrated in monopoly and underrated in the Civil War. Let's go to the thought bubble. Railroads made shipping cheaper and more efficient and allowed people to move around the country quickly, and they had a huge backer, Also a tiny backer in the form of Illinois Congressman Stephen Douglas, who wanted a transcontinental railroad because, one, he felt it would bind the Union together at a time when it could use some binding, and two, he figured it would go through Illinois, which would be good for his home state. But there was a problem. To build a railroad, the territory through which it ran needed to be organized, ideally as states, and if the railroad was going to run through Illinois, then the Kansas and Nebraska territories would need to become state-like, so Douglas pushed forward the KansasNebraska Act in 1854. The KansasNebraska Act formalized the idea of popular sovereignty, which basically meant that white residents of states could decide for themselves whether the state should allow slavery. Douglas felt this was a nice way of avoiding saying whether he favored slavery. Instead, he could just be in favor of letting other people be in favor of it. Now, you'll remember that the previously bartered Missouri Compromise banned slavery in new states north of this here line. And since in theory, Kansas or Nebraska could have slavery if people there decided they wanted it under the KansasNebraska Act, despite being north of that there line, this in practice repealed the Missouri Compromise. As a result, there was quite a lot of violence in Kansas, so much so that some people say the Civil War really started there in 1857. Also, the KansasNebraska Act led to the creation of a new political party, the Republicans. Yes, those Republicans. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So Douglas's law helped to create a new coalition party dedicated to stopping the extension of slavery. It was made of former Free Soilers, Northern anti-slavery Whigs, and some know-nothings. It was also a completely sectional party, meaning that it drew supporters almost exclusively from the free states in the North and West, which, you'll remember from like 2 minutes ago, were tied together by common economic interests and the railroad. I'm telling you, don't underestimate railroads. By the way, we are getting to you, Dred Scott. And now we return at last to slave power. For many Northerners, the KansasNebraska Act, which repealed the Missouri Compromise, was yet more evidence that Congress was controlled by a sinister slave power group doing the bidding of rich plantation owners, which, as conspiracy theories go, wasn't the most far-fetched. In fact, by 1854, the North was far more populous than the South. It had almost double the South's congressional representation, but in spite of this advantage, Congress had just passed a law extending the power of slave states, and potentially, because 2 new states meant 4 new senators, making the federal government even more pro-slavery. And to abolitionists, that didn't really seem like democracy. The other reason that many Northerners cared enough about Kansas and Nebraska to abandon their old party loyalties was that having them become slave states was seen as a threat to Northerners' economic self-interest. Remember, the West was seen as a place where individuals, specifically white individuals, could become self-sufficient farmers. As Lincoln wrote, "The whole nation is interested that the best use be made of these territories. We want them to be the homes of free white people. They cannot be to any considerable extent if slavery is planted within them. New free states are places for poor people to go to and better their condition." So the real question was, would these Western territories have big slave-based plantations like happened in Mississippi, or small family farms full of frolicking free white people like happened in Thomas Jefferson's imagination? So the new Republican Party ran its first presidential candidate in 1856 and did remarkably well. John C. Fremont from California picked up 39% of the vote, all of it from the North and West, and lost to the Democrat James Buchanan, who had the virtue of having spent most of the previous decade in Europe and thus not having a position on slavery. I mean, let me take this opportunity to remind you that James Buchanan's nickname was the Old Public Functionary. Meanwhile, Kansas was trying to become a state by holding elections in 1854 and 1855. I say trying because these elections were so fraudulent that they would be funny, except that everything stops being funny like 12 years before the Civil War, and it doesn't get really funny again until Charlie Chaplin. Ah, Charlie Chaplin, thank you for being in the public domain and giving us a much-needed break from a nation divided against itself, discovering that it cannot stand. Right, so part of the Kansas problem was that hundreds of so-called border ruffians flocked to Kansas from pro-slavery Missouri to cast ballots in Kansas elections, which led to people coming in from free states and setting up their own rival governments. Fighting eventually broke out and more than 200 people were killed. In fact, in 1856, pro-slavery forces laid siege to anti-slavery Lawrence, Kansas with cannons. One particularly violent incident involved the murder of an entire family by an anti-slavery zealot from New York named John Brown. He got away with that murder, but hold on a minute, we'll get to him. Anyway, in the end, Kansas passed 2 constitutions because, you know, that's a good way to get started as a government. The pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution was the first that went to the U.S. Congress, and it was supported by Stephen Douglas as an example of popular sovereignty at work, except that the man who oversaw the voting in Kansas called it a vile fraud. Congress delayed Kansas's entry into the Union, because Congress's primary business is delay, until another more fair referendum took place, and after that vote, Kansas eventually did join the U.S. as a free state in 1861, by which time it was frankly frankly too late. All right, so while all this craziness was going on in Kansas and Congress, the Supreme Court was busy rendering the worst decision in its history. Oh, hi there, Dred Scott. Dred Scott had been a slave whose master had taken him to live in Illinois and Wisconsin, both of which barred slavery, so Scott sued, arguing that if slavery was illegal in Illinois, then living in Illinois made him definitionally not a slave. The case took years to find its way to the Supreme Court, and eventually in 1857, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney from Maryland handed down his decision. The court held that Scott was still a slave, but it went even further, attempting to settle the slavery issue once and for all. Taney ruled that black people, quote, had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro must justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. So that is an actual quote from an actual decision by the Supreme Court of the United States of America. Wow. I mean, Taney's ruling basically said that all black people anywhere in the United States could be considered property, and that the court was in the business of protecting that property. This meant that a slave owner could take his slaves from Mississippi to Massachusetts and they would still be slaves, which meant that technically there was no such thing as a free state. At least that's how people in the North, especially Republicans, saw it. The Dred Scott decision helped convince even more people that the entire government, Congress, President Buchanan, and now the Supreme Court were in the hands of the dreaded slave power. Oh, we're going to do the mystery document now? Stan, I am so confident about today's mystery document that I am going to write down my guess right now, and then I'm going to put it in this envelope, and then when I'm right, I want a prize. All I ever get is punishment. I want prizes. Okay, the rules here are simple. I guess the author of the mystery document. I already did that, and then I get rewarded for being right. All right, total confidence. Let's just read this thing, and then I get my reward. I look forward to the days when there shall be a servile insurrection in the South, when the black man shall assert his freedom and wage a war of extermination against his master, when the torch of the incendiary shall light up the towns and cities of the South and blot out the last vestige of slavery. And though I may not mock at their calamity nor laugh when their fear cometh, yet I will hail it as the dawn of a political millennium. I was right. Right here. Guessed in advance. John Brown. What? Stan! Ohio Congressman Joshua Giddings. Seriously, Stan?
Trick question.
Whatever, I'm going to talk about John Brown anyway. In 1859, John Brown led a disastrous raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, hoping to capture guns and then give them to slaves who would rise up and use those guns against their masters. But Brown was an awful military commander and not a terribly clear thinker in general, and the raid was an abject failure. Many of the party were killed, and he was captured. He stood trial and was sentenced to death. Thus, he became a martyr to the abolitionist cause, which is probably what he wanted anyway. On the morning of his hanging, he wrote, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." Well, he was right about that. But in general, any statement that begins, "I, my name," yeah. And so the stage was set for one of the most important presidential elections in American history. Dun, 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 dun. In 1860, the Republican Party chose as its candidate Abraham Lincoln, whose hair and upper forehead you can see here. He'd proved his eloquence, if not his electability, in a series of debates with Stephen Douglas when the two were running for the Senate in 1858. Lincoln lost that election, but the debates made him famous, and he could appeal to immigrant voters because he wasn't associated with the know-nothings. The Democrats, on the other hand, were, to use a historian term, a hot mess. The northern wing of the party favored Stephen Douglas, but he was unacceptable to voters in the Deep South, so Southern Democrats nominated John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, making the Democrats the last remaining truly national party, no longer truly a national party. A third party, the Constitutional Union Party, dedicated to preserving the Constitution, quote, as it is, i.e. including slavery, nominated John Bell of Tennessee. Abraham Lincoln received 0 votes in 9 American states, but he won 40% of the overall popular vote, including majorities in many of the most populous states, thereby winning the Electoral College. So anytime a guy becomes president who literally did not appear on your ballot, there is likely to be a problem. And indeed, Lincoln's election led to a number of southern states seceding from the Union. Lincoln himself hated slavery, but he repeatedly said that he would leave it alone in the states where it existed. But the demographics of Lincoln's election showed Southerners and Northerners alike that slave power, to whatever extent it had existed, was over. By the time he took office on March 1st, 1861, 7 states had seceded and formed the Confederate States of America, and the stage was set for the fighting to begin, which it did when Southern troops fired upon the Union garrison at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor on April 12, 1861. So that's when the Civil War started, but it became inevitable earlier, maybe in 1857, or maybe in 1850, or maybe in 1776, or maybe in 1619, when the first African slaves arrived in Virginia. Because here's the thing, in the Dred Scott decision, Chief Justice Taney said that black Americans had, quote, no rights which the white man was bound to respect. But this was demonstrably false. Black men had voted in elections and held property, including even slaves. They'd appeared in court on their own behalf. They had rights. They'd expressed those rights when given the opportunity. And the failure of the United States to understand that the rights of black Americans were as inalienable as those of white Americans is ultimately what made the Civil War inevitable. So next week, it's off to war we go. Thanks for watching.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, John Green. There we go. Let's get back into our, yeah, there we go. Yeah, interesting thing there as far as the impact of the election. Yes, thank you very much, John Green, sharing with that. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Yeah, yeah, John Brown. Of course, he never made it to the actual Civil War, and you've got Lincoln now in charge of the United States of America. And let's get to the battles. Let's get to the fighting. This is going to be a big deal. Now, for those of you guys who are very much into, you know, the battles and things like that, yeah, I've got a crash course video, not this particular one, I'll show it to you later, which gets into the battles. And there are a lot of battles, and there's reenactments and all kinds of things and so forth. Take a look here. This map actually shows a lot of the battles taking place. As you can see, I mean, no surprise, ultimately, the North wins, South loses. You're going to have a lot of battles in the South, although there's some key battles taking place, for example, up in Pennsylvania, Gettysburg. We'll talk about that. Not today. Antietam, we'll talk about that today. Battle of Bull Run, parts 1 and 2, right across from Washington, D.C. A lot of battles in Virginia. When I was growing up in Virginia, oh my gosh, they had all these different battlefields that had been preserved, and you can go and walk around and look and see what was going on. I mean, basically, the war is finished up here, Appomattox. That's where Lee surrenders. Who are we talking about? Richard Henry Lee. Remember the guy who proposed the Resolution for Independence, the movie 1776? Yeah, a relative of his is going to be the top commander for the Southern troops, the Confederacy. Well, let's get to that, okay? Let's get to the fighting aspects of it. The commander-in-chief, President of the United States, right? He's the civilian commander-in-chief. That's Lincoln. Top goal. Well, let's go through the different goals. Number 1, put that down. Defend the District of Columbia with federal troops. Yeah, you can see why he put a lot of folks in jail in Maryland, because they're going to be bringing in troops from all over the loyal states, the Union states, into Washington, D.C. They're going to be housing troops all over the place. They do not want Washington, D.C. to fall. So that's a top priority, okay? Second priority for Lincoln. Yeah, South, you started it. We're going to finish it. So second priority is aggressively attack the South, right? So you're going to see the Union armies leaving Washington, D.C. across to fight with Confederate troops beginning in the summer of 1861. And Lincoln's like, come on, let's do this, let's do this, let's do this. He will have some frustration with some of his commanders, because some of them are like, I don't know if I necessarily agree with you, President, even though you're the boss, commander-in-chief. Because you can lose a lot of soldiers when you bring them into battle. I mean, it's one thing to train them up and get them ready to fight and so forth, but Lincoln wants them to be used. So he wants an aggressive tactic. In fact, let's look at that, right? On the other side, in fact, let's talk about that. July 21st, 1861, the first Battle of Bull Run. That's what the North calls it. The South calls it the First Battle of Manassas. Same place, same thing, different sides, call it different things. And this is, as I mentioned, near Washington, D.C. The Union brings their troops out, and they find the Confederate troops, and the Union actually outnumbers the Confederate troops there. Although, as the battle goes on, bad things happen to the Union, right? One of the commanders of the Confederate troops, a fellow by the name of Virginian by the name of Thomas Jackson, he's not known as Stonewall Jackson yet, but he rallies his forces that are being overcome by the Union. He rallies them into a tough defense and then a counterattack. And his soldiers refer to him as being so stalwart and so resistant to the Union attack. They call him Stonewall, because you can't go just pushing through a Stonewall. So he gets the name as Stonewall Jackson. He'll be one of the top commanders for the Confederacy, one of their top generals, okay? It's a disaster for the Union. They come skedaddling back to Washington, D.C., and they're like, oh my gosh, the Confederates are going to come. And it's not good. It is not good. So eventually you will have, this is very interesting, this is a fascinating person on the side of the Union. His name is George McClellan, right? And he's not the commander at that first battle at Bull Run, but he eventually will be the top commander. And Lincoln likes him to the extent that he will effectively prepare the largest of the Union armies, known as the Army of the Potomac. That's going to be the army that's going to be engaged in a lot of the fighting going on right here in Virginia and thereabouts, okay? So there's McClellan. He's very good at organizing, supplying, training, equipping, disciplining the Union Army. So Lincoln likes that part, okay? These guys are going to get ready to fight. The thing, though, that Lincoln ultimately doesn't like about McClellan, when McClellan goes into battle, he's not always going to be persistent in using those soldiers, because soldiers die. And he's not going to be effective at the various different tactics of how to, you know, take on your opponent. And so ultimately, I mean, spoilers, Lincoln's going to fire McClellan. Although, spoilers, McClellan's going to try to fire Lincoln. He actually runs against him in the presidential election of 1864. Seriously. Former commander, one of the top commanders of the Union, is going to run against the commander-in-chief, Lincoln. And we know Lincoln's going to win 1864. Why? Because by that time, the Union's starting to win, and the public opinion is like, let's stick with that guy. That happens, tends to happen in U.S. history. If good things start to happen during a presidency, then don't be surprised if the country goes along with them. We'll keep an eye on that for the election of 2020 and see if enough good things have started to transpire with the economy and coronavirus and so forth. That would bode well for the incumbent, Trump, as opposed to if things, you know, are going to not doing so well, that would bode well for the top opponent. Okay, so Lincoln ultimately is going to be reelected in 1864. Okay, because the North is ultimately going to do well. But this guy right here, Robert E. Lee, is one of the big reasons the Union doesn't do so well in the early years of the war. He is from Virginia. In fact, he's got property. You know, the Lees have been in Virginia for a long time. They got property, they got wealth, they've got status. I mean, they've got, you know, they were involved in the Declaration of Independence. I mean, hello. Lee was a well-trained leader, had fought in the Mexican-American War. He was Lincoln's top choice to be the top general. And the Union Army offered him that job. And Lee was like, well, my first loyalty is to my state, Virginia. Let me see. So Lincoln was president in March of 1861, and Virginia going back, and oh yeah, there we go. The Virginia government in April 1861 votes for to secede. So Lee's like, thank you very much for the kind offer. I'm sorry, I'm not going to accept that offer. I am going to, in fact, resign my commission within the United States military. And then he accepts the position as being the top general of the top Confederate Army, the Army of Northern Virginia. They're going to go toe-to-toe with the Army of the Potomac in many of these things. And it's always fascinating because then Lee, his property, he actually had property, great property in Arlington, Virginia, where I grew up. In Arlington, Virginia, looking over the Potomac River across to Washington, D.C. You know, his home was on a lovely bluff that looked out over it. And of course, when he takes that position, the Union Army is like, yeah, Lee, they cross the Potomac River, grab hold of Lee's property, and as the war goes on, they're going to make a point that Lee will never be able to use his property for farming ever again. Because as the war goes on, what is going to be placed into the grounds of Lee's property in Arlington, Virginia? Union graves. It will become a national cemetery. It's Arlington National Cemetery. It used to be Lee's property. That's how that worked out. But in any event, keep an eye on Lee. He's going to be a very, very effective commander in a lot of battles. Sometimes he'll like divide up his troops this way and that way. And I don't know, it's just, he doesn't always win. And ultimately he's going to lose. I mean, ultimately he's going to surrender. But he is going to be an effective commander for the Confederacy. And in fact, he's going to invade the North. I mean, you're going to have all these various different battles and so forth. So we talked about 1861, not that great for the Union, right? Lose some key battles there. You're going to have a second Battle of Bull Run taking place in 1862, so the second major year of the war. Second Battle of Bull Run, second Battle of Manassas, if you're the Confederacy, just outside of Washington, D.C., August 28th to 30th, 1862. Who's going to win this one? Is it going to be the North? Is it going to be the South? Is it going to be the Union? Is it going to be the Confederacy? It's going to be the Union. Oh, the Confederacy. Yeah, Lee's forces are going to win there. And in fact, he moves on then up into September, up into Maryland. Lee is going up into Maryland. He's like, man, if I can attack the North and cause some chaos and so forth up there, and then surround Washington, D.C., we can win, and we can get a recognition of the Confederacy, and it's all over. Key battle there. You can see it right there. September 17, 1862 in Maryland. So not just north of Virginia. More casualties. 22,717 casualties, dead and wounded, combined, north and south, in one day. I think it was the biggest loss of life. It's still in, perhaps I believe, in American history. I mean, it was a nasty, bloody, bloody fight. And we knew, I mean, at this point, we were absolutely, totally at war. It was a slugfest. But the Confederate Army was stopped on that occasion from continuing on up north. Okay. Ultimately, we'll talk more about how the battles play out, and we'll get into those things and all the different ramifications and so forth. We do know, surprise, the North wins, the South loses. We do know industrialization in the North is going to give the North some huge advantages. Even though the South has got some very good generals, the North ultimately is going to have some pretty good ones, and they got Lincoln on their side too that's holding them together. Okay, so I want to turn your attention then. You're going to have an opportunity starting today, and I want you to use this as like homework, and it's worth extra credit. Not too long ago, an excellent documentary filmmaker, Ken Burns, put together this amazing series called Civil War. Ask your friends about it. If they're into like history and stuff like that, they probably watched it. And I'm going to put in for you, I'll give you the YouTube link, and it's the first episode. I'm also going to give you a, for in class, I'd have you guys watch this and fill this out. I'm going to have you do it for extra credit. You want to get some extra credit? You can get some extra credit. It's attached to the Google Classroom, and it's all the questions. So what you want to do is like pull it up as a document, type them in there and so forth, or anyway, number them, all the different questions with the answers. Watch this. It's like an hour and a half or so. I think it comes in maybe just a little bit under that, but it's very good. It talks about leading up to and the early stages of the Civil War with actual words from the various different participants and images and music. Anyway, it's an awesome, awesome documentary. If you get hooked, watch the whole thing, right? I mean, it's like, what is it, 11 or some episodes? Yeah, it's good. Okay, so this one's called episode number 1, The Cause, 1861. Start it today, finish it out today, do the thing. Yeah, it'll be good. And then I'll come back next time with more details on how the Civil War plays out and some of the more battles and the Emancipation Proclamation and Ulysses S. Grant and Battle of Gettysburg and the Gettysburg Address. All kinds of good stuff coming for you. How's that sound? Okay. All right. So I'm going to sign off now. Check out Civil War with Ken Burns. Okay.